In this lesson video, we're going to focus on procedural texture. For this lesson, we'll still be using Blender Render Engine, so make sure Blender Render Engine is selected at the top. If Blender Render Engine is active, we can manage textures by going into the texture panel in here in the Properties editor. Notice if I change this to Cycles Render, for example, the texture panel looks very different. Of course, Cycles Render Engine support both image texture and procedural texture, but the approach is very different. So again, for now, make sure we use Blender Render Engine. To create a texture, first you need to select an object, for example this cube. Remember that material is the hub for textures, shaders, and 3D objects. So make sure our object already has a material. Currently, I'm using the default cube which already has a material, so we are good to go. Okay, next go to Texture panel. We can see in here we have 3 modes for texture: Environment, Material, and Brush. We want to work with texture for material, so make sure we are in Material mode, which is this middle icon in here. Then, in the Texture panel, we can see this list, which basically are texture slots. These slots work more or less like Photoshop's layer, but in reverse. So anything you put at the bottom will actually cover what you have at the top. Notice Blender already created a texture for our material, but it is empty as it is set to none in the type field. Let's remove this texture by clicking this X button, so we know how to create a texture from nothing. Okay, now let's pick the first slot and create a new texture by clicking on this new button. We can name our texture in here or double clicking on the name up here in the texture list. Let's just name it Example. Okay, we can specify the type of texture by clicking on this pull down list. Notice we have so many texture types available. All of these textures from wood, voxel data, until blend are all procedural texture, except 2 of them, which are these 2 textures, image or movie and environment map. These 2 are static, or as we call it, image textures. So basically you need to have external image files or video files to use these 2 textures. Notice how the icons are different. The procedural textures have this red checker pattern, while the image textures have photo-like icon. Okay, let's pick Voronoi procedural texture for now. In the preview section, we can see the texture as a plain image, or applied as a material, or both. Also, if we go to Material panel, we can see the material actually already changed like this. But we don't see it in a 3D view. Well, this is because we are in the default shading mode, which is the solid mode. If we switch to Rendered Display mode, now we can see the Voronoi procedural texture on the cube's surface. To switch back and forth between solid and rendered view, you can use Shift-Z shortcut. Okay, while in Rendered Display mode, as we can see, we have this dark area. And if we zoom in close enough, we can see these seam lines and distorted texture. Now to fix the dark areas, these dark areas is due to the light source position that we have currently in our scene. If we press Shift-Z again to go back to solid mode, we can see the lamp object in here. This is what actually emit light and causing the shadow on these sides of the cube. Now when tweaking textures, you generally want to see the texture without any light or shadow interfering the way. To do that, we can go to the Material panel. Notice down here you see Shadeless option. Turn it on, and as you can see in the Material preview and also on the 3D view, the color of the material become flat. No light nor shadow can affect it now. Next, let's focus on why this texture is distorted like this. This distortion happens because the texture uses UV mapping by default, yet our 3D object doesn't have any proper UV mapping. Okay, you might be wondering by now, what is UV mapping? Don't worry, we're going to cover this in later videos. For now, let's go back to Texture panel. Scroll until you see this mapping section and coordinates field. We can see by default it is set to UV. If we click on it, we can see so many options here. What's so great about procedural texture is that most of them can be generated in 3D space. This global value in here, for example, means that the Voronoi procedural texture will be mapped based on the world 3D space. You can also use object in here, which essentially use 3D space also but reference locally to the object's transformation. I'll pick global for now. With this option, you shouldn't see any seams or texture banding, although the 3D object doesn't have any proper UV mapping. Next, we're going to discuss how we can control procedural texture. In the texture panel, where we can see the section named Voronoi, in this distance metric pull-down list, we can change between different algorithms to produce the pattern. For example, we can choose Manhattan in here to produce more diamond-shaped pattern. Or we can choose Chebyshev to create more square-like pattern. So many options you can try in here. For now, let's go back to actual distance. Down here in the coloring section, we can pick position, for example, or position and outline. As we can see, we can create interesting textures just by playing around with the parameters. Now, I'm not going to discuss all of the parameters on all of the procedural textures in Blender because that will be too long and too boring for you to watch. And also because the truth is, I don't know much of the technical details behind each of the parameters, like why this is called Manhattan and this one called Chebyshev. Really, I have no idea. My advice is just go play around with it, experimenting with these different parameters. There are two more things that I want to discuss in terms of procedural textures. First is determining the colors, and second, stacking textures. Let's change this Voronoi texture to a different procedural map, let's say wood. Notice by default, it doesn't look like wood at all. We can see white and purple color strips on this texture. Now, this white color is actually the diffuse color we have in the main material. So if you want to change it, you need to go to the material panel, click in here and then choose light brown color, for example. Okay. Now, the purple color we see in here is the color that actually driven by the procedural texture. So, go back to the texture panel, scroll down until you see this purple color. Click on it and change this to dark brown color. Now, we're starting to see a wood-like color, although the pattern still doesn't look like wood at all. Let's fix this. In the wood section, choose stripe. This will make both sides of the line pattern's edge become smooth but sharp at the center. Then choose ring noise in here, so we have some natural rounding noise on the wood pattern. Then change the X size value to 0.2, Y to 0.2 also, and increase the Z size value to 3. Now we have better looking wood texture than before. As you can see, sometimes you need to tweak a lot of things in procedural texture to get the look that you want. Okay, the last thing we're going to discuss in this video is layering. We can stack texture on top of other texture. For example, let's create another procedural texture on top of this wood texture. To do that, simply click this empty texture slot below the wood texture and then click this new button. Then let's pick Stachy, for example. Change the mapping coordinates to global as before. And then let's change the basis to Voronoi Crackle. And let's invert the color by selecting this Wall Out option up here. We can change the color to perhaps dark brownish color. I know this doesn't make any sense right now. How come a wood texture is tight like stones? Well, the point of this lesson is that you can stack a texture on top of other texture and create more complex and unique texture from it.